Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you here for this virtual maker talk with Erin Fletcher. As you know, originally this was to be an in-person event at the school during the Drop Dead Gorgeous exhibit. So we're very excited to have been able to translate that to this virtual format. As much as we'd rather see you all in person and see each other in person, this is a great second best. A few general housekeeping things to note before we begin. Please make sure that you stay muted so as to avoid ambient noise. You can have your video either on or off. It's not required for this event. We will be recording this event to be able to share afterwards. We'll begin with Erin's presentation, followed by a question and answer segment, and end with a pre-recorded presentation by fellow exhibitor Sue Doggett. For technical questions, please use the chat function. We'll save questions for Erin until the Q&A portion. You can find the chat by hovering over the bottom of your Zoom screen and clicking on the word bubble icon, which will expand into a chat window. If you're unable to stay for the entirety of this event, not to worry, a recording of the full event will be made available afterwards on our website. Erin Fletcher graduated the NBSS bookbinding program in 2012, so let's let her begin. Thank you, Erin.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to my virtual maker talk, live from my living room in Boston, Massachusetts. I want to first just thank North Bennet Street School for organizing this, and to Kristen and Barbara for making things run smoothly. So during the presentation, I'm going to discuss my somewhat typical route for creating a design binding, and how sometimes other work or current work in my studio, experiments I've done in the past, can inform decisions on new work. I'm going to be focusing specifically on the binding I created for the Drop Dead Gorgeous exhibit, which is a binding of La Prose du Transsibérien. And it's up on the screen now, and this was bound in 2019. So for me, the first step of any design binding is read and research. What I will typically do is photograph the pages of the book. I like to have very little contact with the book, especially if it's a fine press printed book. So I will read the images on my laptop and jot down anything that comes to mind, or anything from the actual text that I find inspiring or interesting. This can be a color, a place, an object, or just an idea. And those notes then become the springboard for designing the cover or for further research. These are images that I took when I received the text. It's actually in French, so I did not read these exact photographs. I worked from translations that I found online. Here are some of the notes that I took while I read through the text. So when it came to the research portion, I had a little bit of an idea of this kind of larger backstory. And I knew there was this really rich history that I wanted to investigate a little bit more before I approached the design phase. So La Prose was originally printed in 1913 and was considered a landmark achievement for its time. And it is considered or credited as one of the greatest illustrated books of the 20th century. So to speak a little bit more about the actual text, on the image on the screen, on the left-hand side, you can see the text fully opened. And it contains a poem by Blaise Cendrars, which is letterpress printed on the right-hand side in about 38 different typefaces. And then it's paired with this really beautiful, vibrant pochoir illustration, which was designed by Sonia Delaunay. So fully opened, it measures to about 6 feet long. The other image on the slide is showing you what it looks like when it's fully closed. So what happens is it is folded in half lengthwise, which divides the text in the pochoir. and then it's folded down into an accordion. Original copies kind of varied, but it was about 18 to 21 panels. And when it is closed, it measures to 90 millimeters by 180 millimeters, or about 3.5 inches by 7.5 inches. And it is housed in this really beautiful painted vellum wrapper inside an acrylic slipcase. Because La Prose is so celebrated, a lot of facsimiles have been created over the years, but none were really able to capture the vibrancy and the spirit of the original. Pictured alongside the open text is Katie Maryatt. She's the director emeritus of the Scripps College Press. And she set out on this incredible, ambitious project to create an edition of La Prose as close to the original as possible. And to do this, she was going to need to use those same techniques, letterpress printing and pochoir. So this recreation is the text that I bound for the exhibit. Part of my research led me to Kitty's blog, where she documented her own investigations and processes. And this gave me a real insight to her journey and sort of what aspects of the original project influenced her. Once I've concluded my research, I realized that I wanted to create a design and a binding that was going to highlight not only the work of Cendrars and Delaunay, but I also wanted to give a nod to Kitty's ambitious efforts to recreate this work. Delaunay had made a comment about the text that it, quote, had elaborate openings of folds, seeing nothing at all until the last unfolding. And this is really true because it's such a long, elaborate folding. Not until that last fold are you really immersed with the color of the text. And that was something that I was kind of thinking about, and how it also relates to bindings. When a design binding is designed to wrap around the front cover to the back cover, the full image is not really realized until the book is fully open. So I was considering that when I was laying out my design, but also in the way I designed the binding structure. So it's actually made up of 2 separate panels. So from the side view, you get kind of a glimpse of what you're going to see when you open the book on the inside, that little strip of orange with little hints of color. And the way I designed the interior, which I will show you later, is a further hint to what the text looks like. So the way I've described the format of the text, you might realize how it's kind of unusual. And I felt that the binding needed an unconventional approach as well. If you've had a chance to see the other bindings in the exhibit, you would have noticed that there were several different approaches to the style of binding and the shape of the binding. Some of the binders in the exhibit received their pages unassembled, unfolded, and they were able to fold them as they wished. I received my copy completely folded in the manner I described earlier. So at this point, I've finished my research. I have some idea of what the design of the binding is going to look like. And I know that I want to work in this kind of narrow, long landscape format. So I was contemplating the style of the binding, and I had to acknowledge the challenges in opening the text block. It's very difficult to open on your own. I had to have my studio mate help me open it. So I needed to make something that was going to open completely flat and not hinder whoever was going to be opening the text. Just so happened that a year earlier, I had taken a workshop with Jonathan Maryatt at the Paper and Book Intensive, and I made this model that you see on the screen of a collapsible enclosure that he works with, which is really just like a flexible hinge structure. This allowed me to create a binding that was going to open easily and lay flat, and also that I could work with these individual panels for the covers and the spine. So I created a few models to get a better understanding of this structure and what my order of operations were going to be. This helped me kind of figure out how I was going to actually attach the text block to the binding. And so you can see here that is actually sewn through one of the spine pieces, the inner spine piece, just like a 5-hole pamphlet. And it's just at a single fold in the text block. So this is sort of how the actual book opens. You can see that the binding is lying completely flat, and it opens parallel to the binding, and then you actually have to flip it and open it perpendicular to the binding. I did add a vellum tab to the sewing to just strengthen any stress that might be on the binding. So I knew at once after reading through the text that I wanted my design to focus on Cendrars' poem. I was just incredibly captivated by all of his vivid and striking imagery. A lot of different lines jumped out at me and were sort of tumbling around in my mind as I was considering ideas. I decided to focus on the line that I found the most striking, which is, "When a train threads the night, comets fall." So taking this element, in addition to the railway map that was printed at the beginning of the text, which you can see on this slide, I started fleshing out some ideas. And these are just some random sketches that I was kind of doing in that research reading process. The subject in the poem reflects a lot on what is happening inside the train and what he's seeing outside the window. He's talking about the different landscapes, the architecture, and he's often making comparisons to cosmological features. So this idea began to emerge to create a star chart as my design. So I was looking at 17th century star charts, and the whole sort of design started forming. This is one of my earlier sketches. This is a kind of a moving forward in the sketching process. I just wanted to point out some things that kind of got scrapped in the final design. Part of the star chart was adding these constellations, and it's a little hard to see on this slide, but it's sketched out in pencil towards the bottom, this horse skull and a snake. My idea here was to include line tooled stars under the embroidery. That was something I couldn't really figure out how to do. And in the end, the embroidery was going to be really detailed and dense that I thought if I could do the tooling, it was just going to get lost or kind of look muddled. So here's my actual final drawing. And what you're seeing here is just the front cover of the book and the spine. Whenever I've completed a drawing, I will photocopy it, and the copy allows me to jot down notes of, what portion is going to be what material, what technique I'm going to be using for different parts of the book. I'll use it to trace out any templates that I'll need for the actual execution process. And I do this just so that my final design doesn't get damaged. So I think for me, it's fair to say that, a text can kind of push me in two directions. Sometimes I might be really inspired by the whole text and I'll want to create a denser design. I think that can be challenging because you want to create a cohesive design that is balanced and not sort of overloaded with imagery. But sometimes I'm just inspired by a moment or feeling of the text. I never really know what direction it's going to take me. But I also find that what I'm doing in the studio at that time can also influence my design choices. So these are just two other projects that I was working on. And I think really at this point when I was creating La Prose, I was starting to layer more techniques and bringing in kind of stronger colors, and starting to work with other embroidery stitches. So now I'm just going to go through different design elements on La Prose. talk about their design, the source material that I used, and the techniques that I used. This is an image of the different panels and what it looked like before I did any embroidery. I just kind of always love these shots because the embroidery adds so much more information and so much more texture and design. So it's nice for me to see the kind of before and after. So this was that element from that first line that really striked me, the when a train threads the night, comets fall. So the comet/train is based off of what the engine from the original Trans-Siberian train looked like. And the tail of the comet is a hand-dyed leather that has embroidery and palladium tooling. So this was my process for creating the hand-dyed leather for the tail of the comet. It all came from this, in the center here, this piece that I created during a workshop I took with Nikki Oliver. So taking that, I sort of recreated it with similar colors for the comet, and that was the final piece over here. The other image is showing you kind of what a cutout version of that onlay looked like. And then below it is the template that I used for the embroidery and for the tooling. The border that runs across the entire design was really inspired by St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow. The city of Moscow is referenced several times in the poem, and this is also a place that I've always really wanted to visit. So it was really a delight for me to look at these images and pull inspiration from them. So I was looking a lot at the spires and the domes, pulling out shapes and colors. The star that you see on the spire is also the shape that I used to tool along the railway. And these are marking different cities that are referenced in the poem. To create the border, the scallop border is just alternating layers of hand-dyed goat skin and a white goat skin. And then these pieces were laminated to a piece of teal goat skin. The triangle border, as I call it, but it's kind of a zigzag border, is 3 different layers. The base layer was surface gilt with moon gold. It was just a fair goat skin. The middle layer is that same dark orange that I used in the scalloped border. And then the top layer is a slightly brighter orange. And then this shows you the kind of the embroidery process. So I've already done pretty much all the embroidery on the scalloped border using backstitch and chain stitch. And then I've done some stitching over that top layer on the triangle border. And now I'm going and starting the couching. And this is a technique that allows you to apply a thicker line of thread. And it's just tacked down at various spots using the same holes in the embroidery going over that top layer. You can also see the different punching templates that I had for each of the borders. So each segment of the border had its own unique punching template. So this is a binding that I did in 2017 of Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. I decided to use the same aesthetic of the bottom half of the book for the constellations on La Prose. So it's the same color leather, and I have a similar tone of embroidery. So all of the triangles are embroidered. For La Prose, I decided to use a little brighter, wider thread for the constellations, which actually make them more hidden. I kind of like that you have to move the book around and catch the constellations in the raking light. So another really impactful line from the poem that led me to this star chart design is towers and train stations like constellations to my eyes. This gave me the opportunity to just pull in more references to the book. So this particular one is referencing the Legend of Novgorod, and it's a horse skull with a snake emerging out of the socket. And you can see my source material that I used to create my design. The remaining constellations are actually on the back cover of the book. So there's only one constellation on the front cover. And the other three are a lily, a train station tower, and a swan. So for the tower, again, Moscow is referenced here as in the city of 1,003 belfries and 7 railroad stations. So I looked at a bunch of different stations in Moscow, and I found this one of the Yaroslavsky train station to just be the most interesting architecture. And it is set along the Trans-Siberian Railway. The lily is referring to the protagonist's female companion, and he refers to her several times in the poem. I think this is the first moment. There trembles a gentle silver lily, the poet's flower. And this image is just showing you that I will often take my design and just resize it to find the perfect fit for the design. The final constellation is a swan. There are a lot of references to different types of birds in the book. There's actually not a reference to a swan, but here I was trying to evoke an albatross. I really wanted to find an image of an albatross with its wings fully open because they have such a magnificent wingspan, but I just didn't really find anything that worked with my vision. So I chose to use this image of a swan instead, you know, seeing it from the belly side and this kind of undulating neck. I just really loved the way it was drawn. This is how I set up for the embroidery. So these are the two kind of larger constellations, the horse skull and the swan. So to explain this setup here, the drawings are on tracing paper and they are taped to the base leather, which is then taped to a piece of foam, like a dense foam. And then under the foam is my cutting mat. And what I will do is punch through the tracing paper with an embroidery needle that is in a pin vise. I will punch out the entire design unless it's really complicated. These are not considered complicated to me, but if it's even more dense than this, I might punch as I go. But I do keep this tracing paper template nearby while I'm stitching as a guide. It kind of acts as my sort of dot by dot, like if I don't know exactly how to connect the dots, it helps me put them together. And so now I just want to talk about the interior view of the book, which I'm describing as an end paper, but it's not really a traditional end paper. So this was my nod to Kitty's portion of this project. While I was doing research on her blog, I came across these images of these master tracings that she did in preparation for recreating La Prose. I just really loved these preliminary drawings, and I think it really connects to Kitty's hand in the project. So I took these images and I just simply printed them and cropped them to kind of focus on shapes that I found most interesting, retrace them in Sharpie. I was working on a light table with this template so that I was able to see through this orange Kozo paper. I found this process to be kind of freeing. The binding itself, the design was really structured, and this just gave me the opportunity to just kind of play with color. I really had no specific direction as I was choosing colors. The little board that is in the image shows that I was testing to see whether or not I needed to face the kind of teal millboard with tissue. Because what can happen is the color of the board can sometimes dull the paper, especially if it's somewhat transparent. So facing it with tissue just gave me a brighter look for the finished piece. And here's an interior view of the binding. And then lastly, I just wanted to show you how I created the clamshell, how I treated the clamshell. This whole project comes with a little booklet that goes into detail about the recreation project and highlights the contributors to the project. So that little booklet just lives in a pull drawer underneath the binding. And earlier I pointed out that the text block comes with this painted vellum wrapper. I used part of that painted vellum wrapper for that reinforcement tab on the inside of the binding. And then the rest of it I inset into the front cover, the spine, and the back cover of the box. If you want to know more information about this entire project, I definitely recommend checking out Kitty's blog. There's lots of great images, lots of great videos of her doing the pochoir and learning that technique. You can find more about me and my other work on my website and on Instagram. And if you didn't get a chance to see the exhibit, you can at least view a slideshow images of it on the North Bennet Street blog. Thank you very much for watching.
Erin, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your skill and your gorgeous work with us. For those of you who stepped in after we began or don't know who I am or who we are, or maybe you're not supposed to be here, I don't know, welcome. I'm Kristen Odell. I'm the Retail and Exhibit Manager at North Bennet Street School, and we're talking with Erin Fletcher about her Drop Dead Gorgeous binding. We are now going to open up for some question and answer. Before I do, I just want to second what Erin said, that we do have a tour, a virtual tour of Drop Dead Gorgeous on our website, and I believe Barbara has sent the link out to everybody for that. So we're going to open up for questions, and you can use the chat option, which is at the bottom. If you hover over the bottom bar of your Zoom app, there should be a window that pops up. Give me 1 second. If you're having trouble finding that, you can click raise your hand, or you can just wave at me if we can try to find you. You also can send me a reaction, and I'm going to read your questions to Erin. Let's see if I missed any here. A lot of thank yous from McKee Berkman. Erin, how long was the design process start to finish?
Oh, McKee, that's a great question. I would say the design part was maybe over a couple of months. I had a very short window to create this binding. So in total, I worked from April, well, the binding itself was made from April to May, but I probably worked on the design from like January to February, I would say.
That's great. From Jillian Stewart, I have a question. Can you talk about the embroidery process? Is the leather backed with anything to stop paste striking through?
When I was first trying this technique out, I did play around with backing the leather, and I've found over time that it's not necessary. I have had really no problem with strike through, and I'm using a paste anyway, so the 1 or 2 times that it's happened to me, it's been really easy to clean up, and it hasn't damaged or stained the leather or the embroidery. Does that answer the whole question?
I think so.
All right.
If you're trying to raise your hand, I am trying to scan through to see if anybody has any questions. If not, you can, at the bottom, you can hit that button for reactions, and I'll find you. I have questions if nobody else has questions. So some of my questions are just that you spoke about your desire to visit Moscow, and how you sort of traveled there through this binding. How frequently does that happen for you? I mean, you do these beautifully graphic, multi-textural, using all these materials, that's your style of binding. How often do you get to sort of, go visit a place via your binding?
I think it depends on how much research I decide to put into the actual design. For one of the bindings I showed in the presentation of roadkills, I was definitely investigating the landscape of the wood engraver, because he was very much inspired to create these engravings of roadkill animals as he was traveling from college to places to go fishing. So I really wanted to know kind of what the rivers looked like in the areas where he was doing this. So yeah, I think it depends on the actual text and how much research I decide to do. But it definitely does happen.
It definitely transports you for sure. I have a question here from Graham Patton. To what extent do you rely on the embroidery to fix onlays to the surface, prevent delaminating? He's wondering about those thick multi-layer pieces.
Yeah, this was the first time I did these really thick layers. And that is one reason why I decided to use the couching to kind of hide those edges. All of my onlays are back paired, and then the stitching is done through both the onlay layer and the base layer. Sometimes the embroidery is just happening around the edges of the onlay, and it's just through the base layer. So I'm not really treating it like an applique technique, which is what you would see in sewing. It's really not used as the form of attachment. I'm using kind of traditional binding techniques for that.
Here's a question that I think all of us would like to know. Will you teach a class on this?
Certainly, and I've taught some classes on this in the past, so for sure, would love to.
Okay. From Vicki Lee, how did you become interested in doing embroidered bindings?
Embroidery is something that I've been doing since I was a kid, and it kind of got put on the back burner when I came to North Bennet Street School. But it just so happened that I came across a book in the library on historical embroidered bindings, so embroidered bindings from the 15th to 17th century, and that's kind of where my two worlds collided. I've been creating embroidered bindings since I think 2011, so it just was finally a way for me to merge these two loves of mine together.
Lizzie Curran would like to know, was the sewing structure something that you thought a lot about, or did, lost it. Sorry. Or did the format present itself with only one option?
I mean, if you look at the bindings in the exhibit, there are so many interesting ways that all of the exhibitors created either some kind of enclosure or a binding for this text block. This was just something that kind of made sense to me, and I really just I knew that I wanted something to lie flat that really wouldn't hinder anyone as they were opening the book, because it was so challenging. So yeah. So I think that there are a lot of different ways you could have explored creating the structure for this. This is just sort of what made sense for the challenges that I was trying to avoid.
And what embroidery thread do you use, and what dye do you use for the goatskin? Two separate questions.
So for the embroidery, I think on this book I used, there's actually metallic thread and cotton floss. I like to use DMC cotton floss, and then I believe the metallic thread is Gutermann metallic thread. A lot of metallic thread is kind of junky and doesn't work really well. It frays really quickly. This metallic thread is really great. And then for the dye, I believe I used Phoebe's dye for the orange.
Mm-hmm. From Martha, can you speak about the wheel shapes in the corners of the covers?
Oh, sure. Yeah, those are two elements that I don't talk about in the presentation. There's a line in the book that talks about the train is moving forward as the sun is setting behind it. So the sun is represented by the wheel on the bottom left-hand side, and then the moon is represented by the wheel on the top right-hand side.
Mm-hmm. Same question, same person asking the question, where did you learn to embroider? You may have already answered this, but any specifics?
I started doing cross stitch when I was a kid, just teaching myself from kits. And then everything I've kind of done since then has sort of just been teaching on my own from different books, different tutorials. I did a little bit of embroidery in college, but yeah, it's really just kind of been teaching on my own.
Mm-hmm. From Jay Tanner, does the embroidery thread from the back ever transverse up through the back after being bound?
Yes, I think like he's asking if it can be, if it's visible from the backside. I have a whole process where I kind of clean up the backside and hide any tails. And I usually don't create any knots on the backside unless I'm doing a French knot on the top side. So there are ways of kind of fraying out and flattening that thread as much as possible. But there have been binders who have used embroidery as a technique and utilize those strings on the backside to create more texture on the front side.
I have another question for you. The use of the painted leather for the shooting star, also which is the star on the front of the train.
Mm-hmm.
Did you dye that specifically for this, or was it just a coincidence that you were taking the class and it just came to be that that was perfect for the piece?
Yeah, I think, yeah, the coincidence is just that I had created that during the workshop, and that led me to create a whole new dyed piece of leather for this book. Because there were certain aspects to that piece I made in the workshop that I didn't quite like for this project. So yes, I created a whole separate piece, and I also like to have extras. So it was a really huge piece. I could have cut maybe like 10 or 15 tails out of it. So.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have any more questions? Not seeing any. So I thank you all for all of your questions. We are now going to segue into a video presentation by Sue Doggett, a fellow exhibitor and bookbinder from England. Her presentation will run about 25 minutes. You're welcome to stay for the entire recording, but don't worry if you can't stay. We will make all of this available at a later date.
Hi, this is Sue Doggett talking from South London. Thought it'd be nice to say hello since I can't be there with you. I hope you enjoy listening to my talk on La Prose and how I made it, and some of the ideas behind the design. I'd just like to say thank you to Jeff for asking me to do the talk in the first place, and to be able to send it in some form at least. And I hope that you enjoy it and that the event goes well, and best wishes from London. Bye. Before I begin my journey through La Prose, I thought it might be useful to introduce my working methods and practices so that you can see where it sits in terms of the visual language I use and my ideas about design. I'll show you a few works, they'll be on a kind of rolling slideshow, the kinds of books I make, and then after that I'll go on to a more detailed explanation of La Prose. The language I use when making books is that of the bookbinder. Spine, foredge, end bands, boards, end papers, doublures. The terms of making are based in knowledge of the craft and all that entails. Function, understanding of tools and materials, accuracy, the relationship between hand, eye and brain. The language I use when designing books is often different. Concept, relationship between text and image, impact of context on design, colour, texture, meaning, and so on. The challenge is to be able to follow your creative impulse whilst maintaining the craft skills required by the discipline. I suppose in some ways, the way in which I assemble books is a form of experiment or alchemy, taking bits and pieces that seem to say something to me about how I feel about a subject or idea, and trying to assemble them into something which conveys a sense of this to someone else, a transformation. You can't capture the essence of someone else's ideas because you're a conduit, and whatever you read will be mediated by your own experiences of life. What I try to do is create a texture which is suggestive of some of the ideas contained in the text. Although the design is often an organic process, it's always determined by my engagement with the content of the book. In terms of my own research process, I work very hard at trying to get to some kind of understanding for myself of what I'm reading and how I feel about it. So I read to get a feel of the narrative or subject, then I read to pick out the finer detail, and then I read between the lines, and I may consult other materials that are related, objects, images, any kind of contextual material really. The materials I use to make books are sensual and pleasurable to work with. They also have inherent properties which must be considered when bookbinding. Leather is malleable. You can thin it easily and it can be coloured and tooled. It's also reactive to moisture, dryness, and needs to be carefully controlled in order to maintain its functionality. Some binders I know are enthralled by the grain on leather and produce the most minimal of design so that this grain becomes the main character of the work. I very much admire the restraint of this approach, to just let the materials speak for themselves. But I find it very hard to leave things alone. It's very rare for a material to be left the same colour as it was or to be itself. The materials I use are made into something else, either by sewing, dyeing, painting, or with the addition of found objects and so on, in order to make my own materials, to build up texture and break up the surface of the base material. I'm particularly excited by the possibilities of sewing, machine sewing, hand embroidery, felting, collage, and sewing as drawing. Sewing adds a dimension to the surface. It adds texture. It is also conceptually interesting and can be used to suggest a wide range of ideas. The weaving together of threads is akin to storytelling and can be used to suggest both growth and decay in a narrative. My main aim is to capture something of the spirit of the book, some of the underlying meanings, or an exploration of the narrative. It's a personal response informed by research, but it's not an interpretation. I look for something which seems to me to be essential to the narrative or the overarching idea of the content, and I base my responses on this. So with the introduction done, here's how I tackled Kitty Maryatt's recreation of Blaise Cendrars and Sonia Delaunay's La Prose du My initial design responses to the poem weren't clear-cut, and I played around with the idea of a book as a map, the flow of language, the forms of Russian nesting dolls, and the idea of travel and of expansion. In the final analysis, I suppose I let all these thoughts work together, and they exist simultaneously in both the structure and in the artwork. Since the idea for my interpretation of this work is based around unfolding, I'll discuss each of these elements in turn from the inside out, starting with the book itself, although it might have been just as relevant to discuss it from the outside in, as that's how you approach the work, especially if you were unpacking it, and it replicates the idea of the unravelling of a journey. The poem is an elaborate montage of sensations, images, and narrative fragments, and that's how I approach the, and I say loosely termed binding, although it's more of a boxing, really. From Moscow to Harbin, to Paris through Siberia, fear of the unknown, excitement of unfamiliarity, tropical paradise, beauty, grandeur, war and death, all exist simultaneously, along with the constant reminder that we're on a train, and the scattergun sentences, when read aloud, also allude to the rhythmic intensity of the ride. According to Mary Laura Papalas in her essay, Speed and Convulsive Beauty, Trains and the Historic Avant-Garde, 2015, the poem, and this is a quotation, explores the theme of movement and how it catalyzes the passenger's dreams and thoughts of the past. But there is an ambiguity concerning boundaries between past, present and future, and the train also acts as a time warp when the poet writes, "And this night is like 100,000 others when a train flies through the night." Not even watches nor the sun, the most reliable and natural measure of time, can instill a sense of chronological evolution. And the perpetual advance of the train, every morning we set our watches, the train advances and the sun lingers. Time becomes a nebulous concept, and the blending of future and past are also underscored by the repetition of certain phrases and the suggestion that life is a repetitive and futile loop. The idea of ambiguity of boundaries, of looping and repetition, were key themes in the development of the structure of the binding. This wasn't an easy book to begin binding, as we had to assemble it first to a series of complex measuring and folding instructions, not something I find easy, although I was relieved to find that many of us had had the same worries and difficulties and spent quite a few days thinking about things before actually doing anything. In some respects, leaving the book only folded once may have been easier in the long run, but there was something appealing about following the original fold and its map-like structure. The map references, apart from the obvious one at the beginning of the book, pictured here, are visibly obvious within the structure of the original artist's book. When closed, it becomes, according to Elise Matheson, 2016, a more prosaic, helpfully pocket-sized guidebook, unfolded. Prose's railway map is predominantly located at the top of the work. Furthermore, she suggests, the work is saturated with horizontal and vertical axes, joining to suggest a cartographic grid deeply inscribed in Prose's narrative and material dimensions. Blaise's narrative begins in the city of Moscow, which stretches out with horizontal lines of stations and vertical lines of towers, city of 1,003 bell towers and 7 railway stations, and the horizontal imaginary line of the narrative's central train motif combines with the physical vertical line of its 2-metre length. Similarly, when unfolded into a canvas, we notice a stark grid pattern deeply inscribed into the paper stock by the visible creases resulting from its folded book form. Finally, even when folded, prose is conveniently pocket-sized in dimensions, comparable to the numerous guides de voyage which saw increasing popularity in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, after all this, I decided that the poem, within the structure of the original folded book, opens and closes to suggest both expansion, the journey from home to the unknown and unfamiliar, both personal and physical, and enclosure, a return to the familiar, a recognition that travel also destabilizes as well as offering a new view of the world and oneself in the world. After a stressful number of days, and I won't say how many, so as not to embarrass myself, the books are finally glued and folded. Then comes the issue of how to bind them. I discarded the idea of attaching the book to a binding quite early on, as it became evident that attaching another element to the map-like fold would have made the folding and unfolding even more tricky. So as I was thinking about the content of the poem and the imagery within it, I must have thought of Russian nesting dolls. I've no proof that this was a creative driver, but as soon as I started thinking about slipcases, this is what came to mind. The whole work just expanded from this point, but rather than place the book straight into the slipcase, I made 2 red velvet and Japanese silk-lined trays. This seemed an appropriate housing pre-slipcase for both display and protection. It was also an opportunity to allude to other aspects of the poems: hat boxes, travelling salesmen, sexual references, exoticism, love swoons, couples in the tall grass, and so on. I covered the trays in painted and dyed cloth, adding sewn lines which suggest railway tracks and sidings, and I also added extra artwork after the trays were covered. Whilst working on them, I was thinking about railway stations and how bleak they can feel, the outer environs of the station, the industrial estates, and the dead spaces that exist in between. And I've always thought that when you travel by train, especially in urban areas, you always see the parts of the city that become any city, anywhere. There's a greyness that renders this vision as flat, like a billboard, and the only thing separating you from this continuous billboard is the rain-smeared train window. There is nothing but continuous ash, falling rain, rising peat, whirling Siberia, heavy rebounding sheets of snow. Once the books had trays, the trays needed slipcases. These were a standard construction with a ribbon added to allow ease of access. The covering material is painted in embroidered paper with additional collage elements, and again the sewing alludes to train lines and train stations, but there are also elements of crossing out, obscuring, and deleting random words in the text. I used a found text, a more formal text belonging to a previous era, to contrast with the freewheeling language of Cendrars poetry. The poet Dick Jones, who did a translation of La Prose in 2015, said, "There's a cheerful, reckless iconoclasm about the Transsibérien. It's as if Cendrars has, for no reason other than the downhill thrill of it all, abandoned the conventions of the time and set the writing free. This insouciance seems to have no foundation in a deliberate deconstruction of current stylistic protocols. It appears to arise more from an impatience with anything that might inhibit or constrain the narrative and the eternal commentary that accompanies it. Whilst his prose is more conventionally presented, it is driven by a similar adrenaline rush." As a way of referencing a more formal and ordered pre-modernist world, I used pages from a French 17th century dictionary to cover the smaller slipcases. And although this presents a contrast to the language of the poem, because it's in the form of a dictionary and therefore the text is logical and contiguous, you may find that you may struggle to find significance in the actual content of the text, as it is somewhat arbitrary. I always like to recycle something from a previous project, which forms for me and me alone a connection between the things I make. So these pages, they're not real pages, they're copies of pages, and they were the unused leftovers from a prop I made for a French film about Diderot, and I had to make a book which was designed to open at the same page every time the book was used. All the pages were from the chapter devoted to F, so the form and content of the dictionary pages references the old world, the death of history, and the words will begin with FOI, which translates as faith, which was interesting. What happened then was a kind of slipcase mania. So in order to house the twin slipcases, I decided to make another one using the Russian nesting doll idea, and this one was themed differently. The map theme was still in the forefront of my mind, but this time I found myself thinking about the part of the poem where Cendrars enters the war zone. And although referring to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, as Marjorie Perloff suggests, perhaps this hallucinatory sequence with its burning trains, its narrator's eye transformed into a real signal light, and its dance of amputated limbs, eerily prefigures the war of which Cendrars could as yet know nothing, a war in which he was, in 1915, to lose his own right arm. Fire was on all faces, in all hearts. Idiotic fingers were rapping on all window panes, and under the force of fear the stairs burst open like abscesses. In all the stations, all the wagons burned. So the idea for the covering of this slipcase came from a map, again, but a field map, a war field map, with artillery placements, trenches and so on. And this image is a sketch map of the Battle of, and I apologise for my pronunciation, Ta Shi Chao, July 1904. So this is what inspired the design for the cloth. So what you can see here are 3 close-ups of the treatments on the cloth for the slipcase, and I've used sewing and bits of found paper and tooling, although I use the term lightly. I've just used traditional bookbinding tools, gold tooling tools, to make marks on the cloth, and rubber stamping and that kind of thing. So it's just a made up impression of the kinds of marks that you might find on a field map. The edge of the slipcase was covered in a strip of dyed leather using similar colours to the colours in Delaunay's artwork. And to link the edge of the box with the sewn fragments on the cloth covering, I embroidered onto some of the sewn lines where the colour changes. So that was just to finish the box off. After I'd done this, I considered making more slipcases that referred to different aspects of the poem, but this rather grandiose idea was ditched when I revisited my initial ideas relating to maps. I decided it might be interesting to make a fold-out box based on the construction of the Japanese Shiho-Jitsu 4-sided case. The poem and Kitty's accompanying booklet would sit in their slipcases in the central panel of the folding box, the centre of the unfolding world, as seen from the train window by a traveller. The box opens out like a map and loosely refers to various points on the journey between the various places in the poem. There's no fixed point of reference or direction indicated, which references the way the language moves erratically from one idea to another. The outside of the box is covered partly in cloth with reinforced joints over which a piece of leather has been applied. The leather was worked as a separate panel with most of the artwork added before covering. Firstly, the leather was pared, and then I began experimenting with onlays. This is the point, apart from the little nod on the edge of the larger slipcase, where I decided to reference the Delaunay pochoir directly. So the unravelling splash of colour is added here, and various resist applications were applied to break up the surface of the leather. The colour on the colour not only refers to the pochoir, it also refers to the section of the poem where Cendrars says, "I slept in my motley blanket, as wildly coloured as my life. My life only kept me as warm as that Scottish blanket, and my continent, seen through a vent from a speeding train, was not as rich as my life." My poor life, that blanket, unravelling over those boxes filled with gold, with which I rolled on and dreamt on and smoked on, and the sole flame in the universe is a single sad thought. The sky is a torn circus tent in a fishing village in Flanders. The sun is a smoking ball. The moon, a girl on a trapeze. A clarinet, a trumpet, a bitter flute, a sad drum. The artwork suggests fleeting moments flashing past, and by creating intercrossing railway lines, bisected by more meandering lines of thought perhaps, I tried to present a sense of movement. The colour may evoke the coldness of Siberia or the warmer hues of Fiji, or both. The east, being on the left of the panel instead of the right, as in the original map, is intended to suggest a journey going back in time, remembering. Of course, when the box is folded up, all the interconnecting lines change and everything's muddled up. Techniques and materials used in the creation of the image are machine and hand embroidery, dyeing, painting, acrylic texture, letterpress blocks, ink, tooling, gold leaf and dyed goatskin onlays. So a real mixture of things going on there. The interior of the box is more melancholic and links the wall map of the slipcase with the darker imagery of the poem. All the railroad stations cracked askew on the road, the telegraph wires on which they hang, the grimacing lampposts gesticulate and strangle them. The world expands, elongates and retracts like an accordion tormented by a sadistic hand in the shreds of the sky. Locomotives in a fury flee, and the holes, the dizzying wheels, the mouths, the voices, and the dogs of misfortune that bark at our parcels, the demons are unchained. Scrap iron. The mark making is similar to the slipcase, and this is sitting on top of more of the French text upon which I've printed text from the poem. The interior of the box is an accumulation of all the visual motifs appearing throughout the binding. The box wraps snugly around the slipcase and is fastened with magnets under the surface of the leather and paper lining. So this is just an image of it being folded around the larger slipcase. Finally, of course, the box of slipcases needed a housing, so the last box left to make was a clamshell to finish it all off. This is a straightforward drop-back construction with a red cotton velvet lining. The colour is a lighter version of the box covering and is completed by a hand-painted title strip in the red and blue of the book's letterpress title. The title strip is actually the spine of the box and not the lid, as you might imagine from the photograph, and that, coupled with the rather uniform dimensions of the box, doesn't make finding the opening very easy. So this is it with a paper lining and the box in situ. So this is the final assemblage of all the parts. When it's all fully opened out, it takes up a lot of space and would be even more if you opened out the book itself. Maybe it wasn't something I'd considered in terms of exhibiting potential because it does take up so much space, but it is what it is, and it arrived where it arrived through a process of organic thinking and discovery. So that's it, with all the bits in its entirety. So I hope I've shed some light on my rationale for the binding and how I came to put it together and what it was inspired by, and thank you very much for listening.
Just want to thank you all for joining us. This has been awesome. And a huge thanks to Erin Fletcher and Sue Doggett for your wonderful contributions to this talk. And everybody stay healthy, and we'll see you soon.